Okay, well, several sessions ago, I introduced you to the concept of foundation cities for Western culture. I told you that a number of historians have argued, and I'm one of them, that Western culture is built on two foundation cities. That there are two foundation cities in the ancient world whose values and ideals, ways of life, whose worldviews, whose ways of looking at the world have blended together to form the foundation of the culture you live in, to form the foundation of Western culture. And I told you that one of those cities was the city of Athens. And I mentioned that it would take us some time to talk about Athens because there's an awful lot of things which come out of Athens which are worth thinking about, worth talking about. Well, now we come to our second foundation city. Another city whose values and worldviews have contributed greatly to the construction of Western culture. And that's the city of Jerusalem. A city which we can take as a symbol for our topic that's going to cover the next, several sessions. It's going to take us quite a bit of time to talk about our next broad topic, and that is the Hebrew legacy. The Hebrew legacy. That word legacy means a gift. A gift of a very small group of people. The ancient Hebrew people, the ancient Jewish people. It's a very small group of people numerically. Numerically a tiny group of people. But they've played a major role in shaping Western culture, shaping the culture that you live in. A much greater contribution than you would think just from their small numbers. A big part of this Hebrew legacy, a big part of the role of ancient Hebrew, ancient Jewish culture in shaping Western culture, comes from a bunch of ideas. Big ideas, powerful ideas. Ideas that are so big and so powerful that when it comes time to talking about those ideas, one of my big challenges is going to be to convince you that they really are big ideas. Because these ideas are so basic and so foundational to Western culture. Ideas about the physical universe, ideas about how time works, all kinds of ideas which are so basic to Western culture that for people who grew up with it outside of Western culture, some of them seem very strange things, but people who grew up within Western culture just assume these things to be true. How does time work? All kinds of assumptions that the culture makes. Well, eventually we'll get around to talking about those big ideas, powerful ideas. But another part of the Hebrew legacy, and the part that I want to start with, is the Hebrew story. The story these people tell about themselves. The story they tell about their ancestors, where they say their ancestors came from, what happened to them, where they went, all the stories that happened to them. It'd be hard to overstate the significance of the Hebrew story in shaping Western culture. There are references to the Hebrew story all over the TV shows that you watch, movies that you watch, the music that you listen to, TV commercials, politicians' speeches. There are references to the Hebrew story on this campus, in the architecture, in all kinds of different ways. There are references to the Hebrew story in the back of the money in your pocket. It's all over the place. And just like with Athens, you really can't consider yourself to be very well educated if you don't have a basic familiarity with the outline of the story, because there are references to it all over the culture that you live in. I mean, it sounds kind of blunt, but you really can't consider yourself to be very well educated. You don't have a basic understanding of the story. Now, whatever you make out of the story is your own business. I don't tell you what to make out of the story. I just tell you what the story is. But you do have to have a basic familiarity with the outline of the story. You just miss an awful lot. You miss references in TV shows and movies, and you miss the punchline of jokes, and you miss all kinds of things. And so I want to give you just a brief outline of the Hebrew story, the major characters, the major outline, the major theme of the story. And our starting point for talking about the Hebrew story is all the way back with first week of class time, all the way back to ancient Sumer. You remember ancient Sumer? The first civilization we know about, which develops in a part of the world called Mesopotamia. You remember all this stuff? Let me pick up my pointer here. You remember that ancient Sumer develops in the southern part of where Iraq is today, the southern part of Mesopotamia. You remember Sumer. You remember that Sumer, of course you remember Sumer's the first civilization that we know about. There we go. You remember an awful lot about Sumer. But the fact that Sumer is the first civilization doesn't mean that everyone in ancient Mesopotamia was a civilized person. Not everybody saw the value of city life. Some people just wanted to live live their lives the way their ancestors had lived for thousands of years, moving around from place to place, living out in the desert, living out in the wilderness, living in tents, moving around with herds of sheep and goats and camels and so on, just living the way their ancestors had lived for thousands of years. They just didn't see the value of city life. They didn't see the value of civilization, and they just wanted to live their lives the way people had. The ancestors had lived for thousands of years. Well, the Sumerians, being kind of stuck up since they'd invented civilization, look out over their city walls and they see these little groups of people moving around from place to place. Maybe you can picture them on the horizon with their camels and so on. And the Sumerians, like I said, being kind of stuck up, came up with a name for these groups of people who wandered around from place to place out in the desert. The Sumerians called them the Abaru. Where'd you go? No? Oh, come on. Okay, the Sumerians called them the Abaru. There we go. There's the word Abaru. That word Abaru is a Sumerian word. It's a word that refers to these groups of people wandering around from place to place. That Sumerian word Abaru is usually translated into English by the English word wanderer. Somebody who wanders around from place to place. But as you probably already knew, and you're certainly picking up on in this course, when you translate one word from one language into one word in another language, sometimes you miss some things. There's some weight to the language that isn't communicated in one word in another language. I mean, this is the usual translation of the Sumerian word Abaru, wanderer, is the traditional translation. But it means a lot more than just a wanderer. It's not a very nice word. It's a put-down word. It's an insult. If we wanted a more living translation of the Sumerian word Abaru, well, we might use the English word bum. That might be a good translation. Somebody who wanders around from place to place, probably up to no good. It's an insult. It's a put down. It's not exactly a dirty word, but it's a fighting word. You know what those are, words that when you use them, people get upset. It's not a very nice word at all. In fact, the root of that Sumerian word Abaru literally means the dusty people. Well, of course, if you think about it, if you lived out in a tent in the desert, you'd get awfully dusty, but it's not a very nice thing to pick up and use to call these people the dusty people, the Abaru. You wouldn't walk into a bar in ancient Sumer and call somebody an Abaru. You'd get a big fight started. Eventually, most of these Abaru groups, though, began to see the benefit of civilization, began to see the benefit of city life, began to move into the cities. Not all of them did. Some of their descendants are still wandering around out in the desert out there. Today, we tend to call them the Bedouins, moving around from place to place with camels and sheep and goats and living in tents and that kind of thing. But by far, most of them began to see the benefit of city life, moved into the cities. And of course, when they did, they stopped being called Abaru. Except for one of these Abaru groups, who long after they'd moved into the cities, long after they'd adopted civilization, called themselves the Abaru. And of course, some of you have already picked up on it. The Sumerian word Abaru and our English word Hebrew are the same word. That's where the word Hebrew comes from, out of the Sumerian language. If you'd wandered into a Hebrew village, a Jewish village, say 3,000 years ago, and you walked into town, it was a nice looking town, you know, and you walked down the sidewalk and someone came walking towards you and you said, "Excuse me, I'm kind of new in town. Who are you people?" They would have said, "Well, we're Abarus. We're the bums. We're the Hebrews. We're the Abarus." And you would say, "No, you're not. You don't wander around out in the desert. You live in this nice little town." And they would have said, "Well, what we do now, but that's where we come from. Our ancestors used to wander around out in the desert. That's who we are. Our ancestors used to wander around from place to place. People would look down on us, call us bums, and put us down, and think we were up to no good. That's who we are. I mean, everybody knows it. There's no point trying to hide it." One of the interesting things that you learn very quickly about ancient Hebrew culture is that names are important. Names are important. The names that parents give their children are important. Names are significant. Names mean something. And it's more than just having an interesting name that means something cool, but the meaning of the name is supposed to guide the child through life. When you run into trouble and you don't quite know where to turn for advice, then you think about what your name means. That's a starting point for thinking about how to work your way out of your problem. It's supposed to guide a child through life. Names are significant and important. The names that these people choose to give themselves are sometimes interesting. And here we have an interesting name of the whole group. Who are you people? We're the Abrus. We're the bums. I mean, that's where we come from. That's what our ancestors were. There's no point trying to hide it. Being honest about where you come from is important to these people. You'll remember I told you that in ancient Greek culture, the first thing you want to know about somebody was what city they came from, because the city gives them their identity. And as soon as you know what some comes from, then immediately you know an awful lot of information. The ancient Hebrew people are a little bit different. The first thing they want to know about you is what your name is, because knowing a name is a connection. It's the start of a personal relationship, and they're willing to take time and fill out the information on the information sheet a little bit more slowly. Names are important for these people. Well, if you'd wandered into a Hebrew village, a Jewish village, say 3,000 years ago, and they still call themselves the Abrus, the bums, the Hebrews, that might catch your attention. You might say, "Well, that's kind of interesting." Well, do you have any stories about your ancestors back when they used to be Abrus wandering around out in the desert? And they'd say, "Oh man, you want stories? That you came to the right place. So we got an awful bunch of stories." And another thing you learn very quickly about ancient Hebrew culture is that this is a great storytelling society. Well, of course, now everybody tells stories. But these are people who care about how the story is crafted. They take pride in how the story is being told. They pay attention to the art and the craft of putting the story together. Narrative is important for these people. They want to communicate the story in a particular way. And oftentimes as you read the stories, if you pay attention to how the story is being told, there's as much to learn there as there is from the story itself. And, well, they might say, "Oh, you want to hear about stories about our ancestors? Man, did you come to the right place? Well, sit down. You're going to be here for a while." And they might start telling you their story. And they might start off with their first patriarch. That word patriarch, as they tell their story, that word patriarch comes from two Greek words. Literally, that word patriarch means the father who is the leader. The father who is the leader. The way that these Abaru groups worked and the way that their descendants still work today is that each of these little groups had a leader whom everybody in the group would call the father. Now, for many members of these Abaru groups, the patriarch would be the literal father, the biological father. These groups tended to practice polygamy. This group in particular certainly did. And so the patriarch would have more than one wife. That means more children than an ordinary monogamous marriage would produce. And so for many members of these Abaru groups, the leader would be the literal father. But for others who are adopted into the group, and that's exactly how they would phrase it, being adopted into the family, being adopted into each of these Abaru groups, then they would call the leader father. They would try to structure their relationship as if he were their father. And they probably start off all the way back in ancient Sumer with their first patriarch, a man named Abraham. Or actually, at the start of the story, his name is Abram. But then something happens to him and his name is changed to Abraham. You'll remember I told you that names are important for these people. Oftentimes in the story, it's not very uncommon at all, something so big will happen to one of the characters in the story that the old name no longer applies and someone has to be given a new name. Something will happen that is so earth-shaking, so psychologically shattering to one of the characters in the story that the old name doesn't fit anymore and a new name has to be given. It's fairly common, and we see it even with the first patriarch. At the start of the story his name is Abram, but then something happens to him and his name is changed to Abraham. But I'm just going to call him Abraham for the whole story because all I'm going to do is give you the high points, the big events, the big characters in the story. And I want to tell you Abraham's story.